What's going on, guys? So last month I finished modeling and texture painting Dan, the proud owner of Dan's Tavern. This month my plan was to create an additional character for my game with three main goals. Number 1, meet or exceed the 3D model quality of Dan's character. Number 2, meet or exceed the stylized texture painting of Dan's character. And number 3, improve my modeling and texture painting efficiency while still maintaining the new benchmark in character quality. Last month, the entire Dan creation process took about 60 hours, but with the improved use of Blender keyboard shortcuts, newly learned 3D modeling tricks, and painting techniques, I felt I could cut the workflow time in half with my next character. So with 3 goals in mind, I set off to create my second character, Joe. Often working in his garage, Joe can quickly be identified by his chain and bright white sneakers. I started off the modeling process by seeing which parts of the Dan model I could reuse and rework, rather than make an entire model from scratch again. Using the proportional editing tool in Blender, I was able to rework the size and positioning of the torso and arms. I tried this method with the face as well, but I messed it up so much, I ended up just deleting the entire head. It was frustrating at first, but gave me an opportunity to model Joe's head from scratch and focus on improving the topology around the different nose and nostril shape. In addition, I messed up the jawline on Dan's character, so I paid extra attention to getting this correct on the new head model. I had to realign some of the facial loop cuts to connect with the existing body, but it ended up working out in the end. Approximately 3 hours into modeling this character, I already had a solid blockout of the entire body and head from all angles. I spent the next hour improving the edge flow and shape of the ears. Using the blue annotate tool was extremely helpful in determining which facial proportions were off. For example, the nose needed to be much lower while the eye shape needed some refining. By hour 4, I was pretty happy with the overall base model proportion-wise. From here, I created some basic eyebrows, his mustache, as well as texture painted the eyes. I then moved on to modeling the shirt and pants. I found these to often be the easiest to make, as the basic shape can be created by duplicating the torso and legs into separate objects, scaling them up, and adding a solidify model to thicken the mesh if needed. The biggest challenge here was trying to make a chain necklace though, which involved various attempts at using the array modifier and curve modifier. After modeling most of the clothing, I spent hour 9 trying to improve the eye by darkening the ring around the iris and adding shadows to darken the outer edges of the eye. Although the eyes weren't perfect, I figured it was good enough to move on to modeling the sneakers. I found a shoe model reference online and began modeling my way from the sole to the top of the shoe. Previously, I would have just tried to fill the reference with faces, but this time I focused on the edge flow as well. I've learned this is extremely important in character modeling, as the edge flow should always follow the curves of a model. When I didn't do this previously, I found myself going back and deleting large areas of faces and reworking the edge flow to properly follow the curved edges of the model. By hour 15, I got the sneaker model pretty close, then added shoelaces and adjusted the tongue until it fit in the proper position. I finally added a little J for extra uniqueness to the character, and at this point I felt the modeling portion was just about done. Dan's character took me about 30 hours just to model, so I felt creating this model in half the time was solid progress. I spent the next 10 hours watching tutorials on proper UV unwrapping for hair and clothing. This also included learning some new stylized painting techniques on where to paint shadows, highlights, reddish accents on stylish character faces to make them seem more alive and a bit more game ready. I attempted to then apply what I learned, starting with a base black color for the shirt. With cloth, there should be wrinkles around the armpits and lower edge of the shirt where it may bunch up, and highlights should generally reflect off the shoulders or upper chest. I tried my best to mimic this logic with subtle shadows and highlights. I did my best on the shirt before moving on to the face. I added shadows along the smile lines and under the neck and brow. The reddish blush color was added on the eyes, nose, and cheeks to add warmth to the character. In researching color theory, a few months back, warmer colors are generally used in cozy type games to convey warmth, youth, and joy in characters and game environments. After adding some details to the face, including shadows around the neckline and elbow region, I attempted to paint decent looking jeans. A couple techniques that worked well included shadows under the bottom of the shirt, as well as the inseams of the jeans. Highlights were used to reflect off the thighs and knees. Finally, adding wrinkles behind and below the knees gave a nice stylized touch. My biggest challenge has been finding the right balance between shadows, highlights, and unique attributes such as folds or wrinkles in select areas. In any case, I finished Joe's character in approximately 25 hours versus the 60 hours it took me to make Dan's character last month. The biggest time savers came from reworking the torso and limbs, rather than making them from scratch again, sticking to set color palettes, and improving my speed with Blender and GIMP keyboard shortcuts. From here I took my improved skills and efficient workflow and set out to create my first female character for the game. I figured this would be another real challenge as the body type is much different and I'm terrible at modeling and texture painting stylized hair. However, I duplicated Joe's body and set out to rework it to fit Rosie, the first female character and biggest plant lover in the entire game. Being that the head of Joe's model had better topology, I duplicated it and began adjusting vertices using the proportional editing tool. I wanted less mesh to work with, so I deleted some edge loops from the head, which allowed me to get closer to the rounded face shape. However, this forced me to detach the head from the body, as reducing the edge count from the neck prevented me from bridging the edge loops between the new head and previous torso. This wasn't too bad though, as working with less edges allowed the workflow speed to be much faster. After 3 hours, I was able to complete the head shape and attach the torso and limbs. I then began refining the facial proportions a bit more, adding in the eyeballs and forming some thicker eyelids. The model still looked a bit alien-like, but with minor changes I felt the model slowly getting closer to the reference image. From here I began modeling a basic shirt and pants with rolled sleeves and cuffs, adding in some support edges to reinforce the cuff shape. Once I was happy with the basic clothes, I attempted to box model an apron. This was a bit tricky as I had to make it loop around without intersecting the clothing, while still getting close enough to hug the character's neck and waist. Next, I box modeled the apron's bow as a separate object. I got the basic loop shape down with a 2D plane, then duplicated it, bridged them together, then added a solidify modifier to create some thickness. Tutorials I watched used curves instead, but for whatever reason I just couldn't get the Bezier curves to work for me this time. I still think it came out pretty good after smooth shading and beveling the tails to add some smoothness to the flat shaded edges. With the clothing and apron done, I felt it was time to move on to my weakest skill, making stylized hair. In my research, the first step is to duplicate the scalp to get a starting base mesh, preventing bald areas and seams. Next, you should block out the larger hair silhouette and finalize the model by creating a few thicker strands depending on the hairstyle you're going for. I did steps 1 and then 3, completely skipping step 2, which resulted in a decent front view, but sides, top, and back looked pretty bad. So for my second attempt, I tried to make 2 larger meshes for the overall silhouette. This actually looked good from the front and sides, but I couldn't figure out how to make the 2 meshes look cohesive from the back. At this point I spent about 4 hours on just the hair, so I settled on 3 larger mesh pieces, and although not perfect, I felt it was good enough to move on to texture painting. I started with the eyes, focusing on stylized techniques I learned from creating the first 2 characters. Then I added a base color for the hair, skin, and clothing, to which I could later add shadows and highlights to. Adding pinkish hues around the nose, cheeks, and eyes quickly improved the model from a 5 out of 10 to a 6 out of 10, while subtle shadows, highlights, and lighting pushed it closer to a 7. I painted the jeans with shadows near the cuffs and inseams, then worked on the shirt, attempting to add shadows near the cuffs and wrinkles. I did my best, then moved on to adding some color variation to the apron along with a rose. Once the clothing had improved, I felt the skin was a bit too pale, so I worked in GIMP to add more warm hues and saturation to the overall texture. I then added a bit of color to the shoelaces and sneaker top line. The white was a bit too bright too, so I adjusted that to an off-white as to not to distract from the face and clothing. Finally, I added some highlights and color variation to the hair along with drawing in an apron pocket to give it more uniqueness. Rosie took me about 20 hours to complete. I was very happy with the final result, so I felt it was time to move on to the next female character, Danielle. This character is focused on restoring the beach and protecting wildlife, so I wanted to use a nature palette of browns, beiges, and greens to reflect that. When it comes to workflow efficiency, my goal here was to duplicate the Rosie model and manipulate the vertices to fit this new character. Although the character was slightly taller, the female face shape was much closer than the first 2 male characters I made. So after only about an hour, I was able to move on to the unique parts of this character, including a jacket, cargo type pants, and boots instead of sneakers. I modeled some side pockets, then duplicated the shirt before using the shrink fatten tool to add some thickness. Finally, I added the collar, which wasn't too difficult after I made one for Dan's character. However, I knew the hair would be a challenge, so I made sure to follow the proper steps of silhouette before strands this time. And in addition, I started with a low geometry sphere, which made getting the overall shape much easier this time around. Once that was done, I created separate sized hair strands and honestly made a pretty decent hairstyle for only my second female character. As with the previous characters, I started with painting the iris and darkening the outer ring, then I added a base color to the hair, shirt, pants, and boots. From here I began adding some subtle texture details, such as wrinkles on the pants, pockets, and shirt. I also fooled around with different images I could add to the shirt texture that would fit the character. After I got the clothing looking pretty good, I worked on painting the face and adding some color variations and highlights to the hair. And after approximately 15 hours, I felt the character was good enough at this stage to move on to my fourth character of the month. Deciding to stay with the beach-themed characters, I started working on Rob, the fisherman in the game. For this model, I decided to go back and reuse the head and body from Joe's character. Although the face and body are much different, I wanted to see if I could use a proportional editing tool without having to delete any of the mesh. In the end, I had to disconnect the head as I needed a few less edge loops, but I was able to leave the body mostly intact. From here, I began modeling my way from the bottom up, starting with rubber fisherman type boots. The boots, shirt and jacket, and pants all took me about an hour each to complete. In addition, I learned how to UV map using follow active quads to accurately map the sizing and direction of the plaid pattern along the shirt, sleeves, and collar. Once the shirt was complete, I worked on making the fisherman's jacket. I was able to reuse the pockets I made for Danielle's pants and repurpose them into different sizes for the jacket. I also modeled a zipper and a hook to add more uniqueness to the jacket. Finally, I wanted to add a hat. I originally thought a worn ball cap with a fish logo would be pretty good, but later settled on a loose-fitting bucket hat instead. I spent the last few hours texture painting the clothing, then painted some facial details to make the character look a bit older and a bit more suspicious than the previous characters. After about 15 hours, I finished the character with a rating of maybe 7 to 8 out of 10 in regards to stylized indie quality. I think with improved lighting, animations, and some other art techniques I'm probably missing at this point, the characters will eventually reach 9 out of 10 in appearance before release. So to recap, last month's character Dan took me about 60 hours to complete, while these last couple of characters took me about 15 hours each to complete. Therefore, if I'm able to keep or even improve this workflow pace, I could possibly have all characters from my game modeled and textured by the end of August. Being that I created 4 characters this month, I'm settling the goal of creating 6 characters for next month. I would also like to spend some time learning other stylized techniques to further improve the quality of my models and workflow speed as I make these additional characters. At this point, I have a full list of character names, clothing, and descriptions. Now it's just a matter of bringing them to life. And as always, thanks for watching, and I look forward to sharing these new characters in next month's devlog.